This is the story of what 70 years of American highways did to nature, and what nature does the moment we open the door back up. Every year, somewhere between 350 and 360 million vertebrate animals are killed on roads across the United States. A number so large, it roughly equals the entire human population of the country. Collisions with large animals alone cause around 200 human deaths, 26,000 injuries, and nearly $8 billion in vehicle damage each year. And that figure only counts the accidents big enough to make it into an insurance claim. But the roadkill you see from your car window is not the real story. The real damage runs deeper, and it took decades of scientific research to see it clearly. What American highways actually built, over 70 years of construction, was the world's largest unintentional experiment on wildlife. Roads sliced ecosystems in half, and then scientists watched over generations what isolation does to a living population. What they found should have been a national emergency. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary rewilding stories in history. To understand why what's happening right now matters so much, you have to sit with what 70 years of highway construction actually did to the American natural world. And it wasn't just the animals you could see lying on the shoulder. When a highway cuts through wild land, it doesn't just create a road, it creates a wall, one that most animals will not cross and many cannot, and nature on both sides of that wall begins to change in ways that take decades to surface. This is what Dr. Richard Foreman, the father of road ecology, first documented in the 1980s. Habitat fragmentation doesn't just divide landscapes, it transforms them. According to research across 5 national parks in the western United States, including Yellowstone, Yosemite, Olympic, Zion, and Wind Cave, habitat fragmentation has been shown to reduce biodiversity by up to 75%, not by a little, by 3/4. Take wolves as the example. When roads push wolves out of a region, elk populations stop being checked, and unchecked elk overgraze riverbanks. Vegetation disappears from the water's edge, streams erode, fish populations fall, songbird numbers drop. One missing predator sets off a cascade of consequences that reaches down through every layer of the food web, and researchers studying those 5 national parks found the same pattern in every single one. Tree populations stopped regenerating, riverbanks destabilized, and entire ecosystems shifted towards simpler, impoverished versions of themselves. And then there was the problem the trail cameras couldn't show you, because it was happening inside the animals themselves. When populations can't move, they can't find unrelated mates. Inbreeding in wildlife isn't an abstract genetic concern. It shows up in bodies. A UCLA-led study published in 2022 examined mountain lions in the Santa Monica and Santa Ana mountain ranges south of Los Angeles. 2 populations cut off from the rest of California by freeways, and the findings were described by the lead researcher as severe. 9 adult males showed signs of inbreeding across both populations, with an average of 93% abnormal sperm, and several animals had kinked tails or undescended testicles, the same physical defects that scientists had documented in Florida panthers before genetic rescue efforts in the 1990s brought Texas pumas in to restore the population. NPS and UCLA researchers then ran population viability modeling to understand where this trajectory was heading. The result was a number that deserves to be read twice: a 99.7% probability of extinction for the Santa Monica Mountains mountain lion population within 50 years. The median predicted time to extinction was just 12 to 15 years from the onset of serious inbreeding depression. A single highway was rewriting a species out of existence, invisibly, because on the surface, the lions were still there, still reproducing, still making the news with their litters of photogenic kittens. None of that mattered if the genetics kept collapsing. In 1996, Parks Canada did something that made a lot of people laugh. The Trans-Canada Highway runs straight through 82 kilometers of Banff National Park in the Rocky Mountains, one of the richest wildlife areas on the continent. And by the mid-1990s, that stretch of road was killing 100 elk per year just on its own. Parks Canada proposed building a series of bridges and tunnels specifically for animals, and the response from locals was not enthusiastic. Editorials in the town paper called it a waste of taxpayer money and stated with confidence that animals would never use them. One letter predicted that wolves would use the highway fencing to trap their prey and slaughter them in front of tourists. None of that happened, and what did happen became the longest continuously monitored wildlife data set of its kind anywhere on the planet, led by Dr. Tony Clevenger from the Western Transportation Institute. What researchers found over the following 28 years changed how the world thinks about road infrastructure. 12 species of large mammals adopted the 44 crossing structures along that stretch of highway, including grizzly bears, wolves, elk, moose, wolverines, lynx, and cougars, and over 200,000 safe crossings were recorded. Elk and deer collisions on that section of road dropped 96%. Large carnivore mortality rates fell between 50 and 100% in sections with crossings compared to open road. But here's the part that caught even the researchers off guard. Grizzly bears, which are among the most road-averse animals on the continent and tend to avoid anything that smells like human activity, took up to 5 years to begin using the new structures. And then they changed. Generation by generation, more grizzlies started crossing, and the crossing rate increased steadily through the monitoring period. The animals weren't just tolerating the structures, they were incorporating them into their movement patterns across generations, which meant the habitat connectivity that the highway had severed for decades was slowly knitting back together. Scientists and delegations began arriving in Banff from around the world, from Mongolia, Argentina, China, and across North America. Biologists from Washington State came to learn how to apply the same principles to the I-90 Snoqualmie Pass wildlife crossings in the Cascade Range. What had started as a controversial local experiment became the global blueprint. The 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law earmarked $350 million for wildlife crossings nationwide, and the Federal Highway Administration has been distributing those funds to projects across the country. In Utah, this new era of investment built on decades of experience. The state completed a wildlife overpass over Interstate 80 near Parley's Canyon in 2018, a 50-foot wide, 320-foot-long bridge spanning 6 lanes of traffic above one of the state's busiest commuter corridors. The engineers and biologists involved made a sensible prediction. It would likely take several years before local wildlife felt comfortable using such a new and unfamiliar structure. That prediction was wrong within months. Trail cameras on the bridge captured not just the expected deer and moose, but cougars, coyotes, bears, and yellow-bellied marmots crossing regularly, and footage compiled from the first 2 years of monitoring went viral at the end of 2020, shared millions of times across the world. What the footage showed, beyond the obvious appeal of watching a moose cross a highway overpass at 3 in the morning, was something biologists found genuinely striking. 706 individual animals used that bridge in 2021 alone, and the collision rate on that stretch of I-80 dropped dramatically, almost immediately after the structure opened. Utah built the first wildlife overpass in the United States back in 1975, and in the 5 decades since, more than 1,000 crossing structures have gone up across the country. That number accelerated significantly after the infrastructure law funding became available, and in December 2024, the Federal Highway Administration announced $125 million in new grants awarded to 16 projects across the country, including Oregon's first wildlife overpass over Interstate 5, a crossing designed specifically for red wolves in North Carolina, and a corridor through the Sandia Gemez mountain wildlife region in New Mexico. In total, Wildlands Network has helped secure over $440 million in public funding for crossings across North America. What began as a local parks program in Canada has become continental infrastructure, and the animals waiting on both sides of American highways didn't need much invitation to use it. Sometime around 2011, a young male mountain lion left the hills west of Los Angeles and traveled east through some of the most densely developed land in the United States, crossing both Interstate 405 and U.S. Route 101 in the process, a feat that wildlife biologists said should have been nearly impossible given the traffic volumes and the absence of any crossing infrastructure. He made it across, settled into Griffith Park's 9 square miles of urban wilderness, and within a few years had become one of the most photographed wild animals in the world. His name was P-22. National Geographic photographer Steve Winter captured him at night in front of the Hollywood sign, and that image circulated globally, turning a solitary mountain lion into a symbol for everything that highways had done to the natural world. P-22's territory was the smallest ever recorded for an adult male mountain lion, a fraction of the 50 to 150 square miles a cat his size would normally require. Surrounded on every side by freeways and development, he never found a mate, never reproduced, and spent nearly a decade alone in a park that was effectively a gilded cage. In December 2022, weakened and suffering from kidney failure, eye trauma, a hernia, heart disease, and mange likely contracted from domestic cats, P-22 was struck by a vehicle. He was euthanized shortly after by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Los Angeles mourned with the kind of public grief usually reserved for human figures. The Annenberg Foundation released a statement that same day. The wildlife crossing, they said, did not come soon enough for P-22. But here's what P-22's story actually unlocked. His decade in Griffith Park made the abstract statistics of highway fragmentation into a face and a name and a story that regular people could follow. Conservation advocates credited him directly with building the public and political support needed to fund the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, the massive overpass currently under construction over U.S. Highway 101 near Agora Hills, 35 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. That crossing spans 10 lanes of highway across a 210-foot bridge, carries over 300,000 vehicles daily on the road below it, and when completed in fall 2026 will be the largest wildlife crossing of its kind in the world. The structure is being built on living soil, planted with more than 50 native species, with sound walls and berms designed to block both light and noise from below. The goal being to make animals crossing the bridge feel as though the freeway simply isn't there. But here's what P-22's story actually unlocked. His decade in Griffith Park made the abstract statistics of highway fragmentation into a face and a name and a story that regular people could follow. Conservation advocates credited him directly with building the public and political support needed to fund the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, the massive overpass currently under construction over U.S. Highway 101 near Agora Hills, 35 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. That crossing spans 10 lanes of highway across a 210-foot bridge, carries over 300,000 vehicles daily on the road below it, and when completed in fall 2026 will be the largest wildlife crossing of its kind in the world. The structure is being built on living soil, planted with more than 50 native species, with sound walls and berms designed to block both light and noise from below. The goal being to make animals crossing the bridge feel as though the freeway simply isn't there. The question for the Santa Monica Mountains mountain lion population was never really whether they would use the crossing. Researchers had no serious doubts about that. The question was whether it would open in time to reverse what the genetics were doing. NPS modeling showed that the population needed connectivity, but the threshold for that connectivity turned out to be almost startlingly small. One new mountain lion migrating into the Santa Monica Mountains population every 2 to 4 years, carrying fresh genetic material from the populations in the Simi Hills and Santa Susana Mountains to the north, would be enough to drop the 50-year extinction probability from 99.7% down to 2.4%. The population didn't need to be flooded with new individuals. It needed a door, opened occasionally, and nature would handle the rest. The Annenberg Crossing will do far more than provide that door for mountain lions. The same genetic isolation documented in cougars has been found in coyotes, bobcats, birds, and lizards on both sides of the 101 freeway, meaning dozens of species have been quietly diverging from their counterparts on the opposite side of the highway for decades. Every one of them benefits when the corridor reopens. The crossing is also a living ecosystem in its own right. Over 26 million pounds of concrete were poured during the first construction phase. 82 bridge girders were placed across the freeway overnight in lane closure windows, and 6,000 cubic yards of living soil were laid across the bridge surface in preparation for planting. The structure is designed to be, in the language of its architects, indistinguishable from the hillsides on either side of it. P-22 didn't make it across, but the population his isolation put at risk will, and the corridor that kept him alone for a decade is being rebuilt right now, due to open in the fall of 2026. What's happening across the American West isn't an isolated success story. From Banff to Los Angeles, from North Carolina to Oregon, a network of crossing structures is slowly stitching the continent back together, and the effects reach well beyond the animals that use the bridges. When predators regain the ability to move, food webs begin to recover. Researchers studying the Banff crossings documented that wolves using the overpasses helped restore predator-prey dynamics that road fragmentation had disrupted for decades, and those dynamics shaped the vegetation along riverbanks that unchecked elk herds had stripped bare. One crossing lets a wolf through. The wolf changes where elk graze, and a stream bank that had been eroding for 20 years starts to recover. That is what ecologists mean when they talk about trophic cascades, and it is what wildlife crossings unlock when they are placed correctly. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative spans 3,200 kilometers of connected mountain wilderness, stretching from northern Wyoming to the Yukon, and crossing structures along that corridor have allowed grizzly bears to reclaim ranges they hadn't accessed in generations, while wolf packs have established territories that cross the US-Canada border and exchange genetic material with populations they had been separated from for decades. And then there is the Iberian lynx, which offers perhaps the most dramatic illustration of what happens when you combine corridor restoration with serious investment in population recovery. In 2002, fewer than 100 Iberian lynx survived in the wild across Spain and Portugal, confined to 2 isolated pockets of scrubland in the south. A program combining captive breeding, reintroductions, habitat restoration, prey recovery, and the construction of wildlife corridors and road crossings across the Iberian Peninsula drove a 2,400% increase in the population over 2 decades, reaching over 2,400 individuals by 2024. The IUCN reclassified the species from endangered to vulnerable, the largest recovery ever achieved for a wildcat through conservation action. Wildlife crossings and corridors weren't the only factor, but they were a necessary one because a population that can't move can't maintain the genetic health needed to survive long-term, no matter how many animals you breed in captivity. There's a trail camera in Banff National Park that has been running since 1996, positioned at one of the crossing structures along the Trans-Canada Highway. Over 28 years, it has recorded grizzly bears in April, elk in November, wolves crossing on winter nights without moonlight, wolverines moving alone the way wolverines always do. None of those animals know that the crossing exists because someone spent years fighting to build it, or that local editorials once called it a waste of money, or that the data from their movements eventually changed wildlife infrastructure policy on 6 continents. They just know the path opened. 360 million vertebrates die on American roads every year, but at every crossing site from Banff to Utah to the hills above Los Angeles, thousands of animals make it across safely because someone decided the wall didn't have to be permanent. The Santa Monica Mountains mountain lion population was heading toward a 99.7% chance of extinction, carrying that trajectory silently in its DNA. And the intervention needed to change that outcome turned out to be smaller than almost anyone predicted. One crossing, placed in the right location, open to 1 new animal every few years. Nature doesn't need us to manage every detail. It doesn't need us to replant every forest or reintroduce every predator by hand. What the research from Banff and Utah and Los Angeles and the Iberian Peninsula all points to, consistently, is that the most powerful thing humans can do for the natural world is to remove the barriers we've built, build the bridges we should have built in the first place, and then step back, open the door, and watch what comes through. Rewilded. Nature always finds a way. Thanks for watching and see you next time.